Hey everyone, and welcome. Have you ever seen a totally empty piece of land, maybe after a construction project, or even just an abandoned field, and then a few years later it's covered in plants and life? How does that happen? Well, it's not magic, it's an incredible natural process called ecological succession. And today, we're going to break down that amazing story of how nature rebuilds itself step by step.
So, here's what we've got on the agenda today. We'll kick things off with what succession actually is. Then, we'll look at all the different types and the step-by-step process. After that, we'll get into two really cool real-world examples, figure out what this final climax stage is all about, and wrap up by seeing how plants and animals adapt to all these changes. Ready? Let's get into it.
All right, let's start with the most important question. What in the world is ecological succession? We're going to define it and then look at the forces that get the whole ball rolling.
Okay, so that's the textbook definition, but what does it mean in plain English? Just think of it like this. It's the slow, predictable way an area changes over time. Imagine that empty plot of land again. First, you'll probably just get some tough little weeds. Then, over time, some grasses will pop up. After them, maybe some bushes. And then finally, years and years later, you might have a whole forest of tall trees. That entire journey, from weeds to a forest, that's ecological succession. So what kicks this whole process off? Well, you can think of it in three parts. First, you need an initiating cause. This is a big event that basically hits the reset button and creates an empty space. Think of a forest fire, a volcano erupting, or a landslide. Then, you have the continuing causes. This is where life begins to move in. New plants and animals arrive, they compete for things like sunlight and water, and they start changing the place. And finally, you have the stabilizing causes, which is usually the climate of the area. The climate basically decides what that final finished ecosystem is going to look like.
Now, as an ecosystem goes through succession, we start to see some really clear patterns. For one, the number of different species almost always goes up. You just get more variety of life. The total amount of living stuff, what scientists call biomass, also gets bigger. I mean, just picture the difference in weight between a few weeds and a whole forest, right? And the whole ecosystem's energy level changes too. It goes from being super productive in the beginning to finding a nice, steady balance later on.
Okay, so we've got the basics down, but it turns out there are different flavors of succession. It's not a one-size-fits-all process. Ecologists actually classify it based on where it starts and which organisms are doing most of the work.
So the two big ones you absolutely have to know are primary and secondary succession. The huge difference between them is one single thing: soil. Primary succession starts from absolute scratch. We're talking bare rock, fresh lava, a place with zero soil. It takes an incredibly long time because life literally has to create the soil from nothing. Secondary succession, on the other hand, happens when a place that already has soil gets disturbed. Think of a forest that's been logged or a farm that's been abandoned. Because the soil is already there, everything can grow back way, way faster.
We can also categorize succession based on who's in charge. Autotrophic succession is the one we usually think of. It's driven by autotrophs, organisms that make their own food, like green plants. This process starts somewhere inorganic, and over time it builds up more and more living material. But then you have heterotrophic succession. This is driven by heterotrophs, organisms that eat other things, like bacteria and fungi. The perfect example is a dead log rotting in the forest. It starts with a ton of organic material, and the whole succession process is about breaking it down. So the amount of energy actually goes down over time.
And just to give you the full picture, there are a few other types. Allogenic succession is when the change is caused by outside forces, like a long-term shift in the climate. Autogenic is the opposite. That's when the organisms living there actually change the environment themselves, making it ready for the next group. And weirdly enough, sometimes succession can go backwards. We call that retrogressive succession, and it happens when an area is disturbed over and over again.
So we know what succession is, and we know the different types. But how does it actually happen? What are the steps? Well, it turns out it follows a pretty predictable path, almost like a story, with a beginning, a middle, and an end.
The whole process can be broken down into these 5 main stages. First, you have nudation, which is just a fancy word for a bare area getting created. Step 2 is invasion. This is where the first tough species, the pioneers, show up and start to settle in. Of course, that leads to stage 3, competition. All those new arrivals start fighting for things like space, sunlight, and food. Then comes a really crucial step, reaction. This is where the organisms that are already there actually change the environment, maybe by adding nutrients to the soil when they die. This change allows new, different species to move in, and this cycle continues until, finally, you reach the climax. This is the final stable community that can pretty much sustain itself indefinitely.
Okay, enough theory, right? Let's see how this all works in the real world. We're going to look at two amazing, classic examples of succession. One that starts in a pond of water, and another that starts on nothing but bare rock.
This one is called a hydrosphere, which is just succession in water. It's wild. It begins with tiny microscopic plants called phytoplankton. When they die, they sink and start building up a layer of muck at the bottom. That muck allows rooted underwater plants to grow. As they die, the pond gets even shallower, which then lets plants with floating leaves, like water lilies, take over. Pretty soon the edges are shallow enough for reeds and cattails. This traps even more dirt, turning the edges into a marsh. And this keeps going for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, until the pond completely fills up and, you won't believe it, it becomes a forest. A pond can literally turn into a forest.
Now, what about starting on bare rock? This is called a lithosphere, and it's just as incredible. The very first pioneers here are these amazing things called lichens. They can grow directly on the rock, and they release weak acids that slowly break it down, creating the first tiny specks of soil. That allows other, leafier lichens to grow, and then mosses, which are fantastic at trapping dust and moisture. All of this builds up just enough soil for small herbs and grasses to take root. Then they get replaced by bigger shrubs, and finally, after a very long time, trees can grow, and you get a full-blown forest where there used to be nothing but bare stone. It's just amazing.
So, we've just seen how a pond and a rock can both end up as a forest. That final stage, we've been calling it the climax community. But what exactly does that mean? And is it really the end of the journey?
So a climax community is basically the finish line for succession. It's the final, stable version of that ecosystem. It's self-perpetuating, which means it can keep itself going without much change, and it's in equilibrium, or in a happy balance with its environment. The types of plants and animals you find there are perfectly suited for the local climate and soil, so things stay pretty much the same year after year.
Now, here's where it gets interesting. Ecologists don't all agree on how this final stage works. The monoclimax theory basically says that in any given region, there's only one possible climax community, and it's all determined by the climate. Everything else is just a temporary stage on the way to that one single endpoint. But then there's the polyclimax theory, which says, hold on, it's a bit more complicated. This theory argues that things like the type of soil, the shape of the land, and even the organisms themselves can create lots of different, stable climax communities, all within the same climate zone. So instead of one single endpoint, you could have a whole mosaic of different ones. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit and talk about the actual plants and animals. To survive in all these different environments, from a soaking wet pond to a bone-dry rock, they need special features, or what we call adaptations. Let's look at hydrophytes, which are just water plants. They have some really clever adaptations for living in water. Many of them have these big, hollow air spaces inside their stems that help them float and also act like little snorkels to get oxygen down to their roots. Speaking of roots, they're often tiny because, hey, when you're floating in water, you don't need big roots to find it. And they don't need a waxy coating on their leaves because they're not worried about drying out.
And then you have plants at the complete opposite extreme. Xerophytes are plants that live in super dry places. To save water, they might have really small, waxy leaves or super deep roots. Cactuses are a great example. And then you have holophytes. These are plants that have adapted to live in really salty soil, like in a coastal marsh. They might have special roots that grow upwards out of the mud to get oxygen, or they can even pump excess salt out of their leaves. And it's not just plants, of course. Animals adapt too. This slide shows some fantastic behavioral strategies. You've got hibernation, where animals like bears or squirrels basically sleep through the entire winter to save energy. There's also camouflage, where an animal's color helps it blend right into the background to hide from predators. And then there's mimicry, which is super clever. That's when a harmless animal evolves to look just like a dangerous one to scare off predators. Nature's pretty smart.
Whew, okay. We have covered a ton of ground today. So before we wrap up, let's just do a quick recap of the most important points to make sure everything is crystal clear.
So here's the bottom line. Succession is simply the gradual, orderly change of an ecosystem. Remember, it's primary if it starts on bare ground with no soil, and secondary if it happens after a disturbance where soil already exists. It follows that clear 5-step process from a bare area all the way to a stable climax community. And finally, every plant and animal involved has special adaptations that help it survive in its particular environment.
And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. We know a climax forest is stable, and we know an event like a forest fire can knock it back to secondary succession. But what kind of massive, catastrophic event would be powerful enough to wipe out everything, including the soil, and send it all the way back to square one, to primary succession? It's a pretty big question. I hope this explanation helped you understand the incredible process of ecological succession. For more clear explanations and daily IGNO videos, subscribe to IGNO Mind Decoded.